Hello and welcome to the Heaven Bound Sunday School class at the First General Baptist Church in Truman. Our lesson today about Joshua, the man who succeeded Moses as the leader of the Israelites. Joshua seemingly is more known for his military abilities than as a prophet, but we know he was a prophet. He proclaimed God's message to the people. He succeeded Moses, and if you remember in last week's lesson, Moses said he was about to die and someone else was going to take over and they would be a prophet for the people, so Joshua being his successor. I think that tells us he was a prophet. God spoke to Joshua, told him what he wanted the people of Israel to do, and that's what a prophet did. He challenged the people to rid themselves of idols and to do what God would have them to do. And in relation to that, the great prophet, Jesus and Joshua, both of those names, they both mean the Lord is salvation. Now, as Joshua led the people into the promised land, God was there with him, encouraging him to be strong and to have courage in fulfilling his duties. I think we all know any kind of leader has got to be strong and they have to know what they're doing. And Joshua appeared to be in that situation for sure. He led the people in there. They were in the promised land. God had promised it to them. So they're in there and now they had to conquer it. We're going to read the scripture, and obviously it's from the book of Joshua, both chapter 5 and chapter 6. I'm going to read the scripture we have from chapter 5 first. We'll talk about it a little bit. It says, "Now when Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua went up to him and asked, 'Are you for us or for our enemies?' 'Neither,' he replied, 'but as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come.' Then Joshua fell face down to the ground in reverence and asked him, 'What message does my Lord have for his servant?' The commander of the Lord's army replied, 'Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy.' And Joshua did so." Now they're in the promised land, and one of the first big challenges they're going to face is the city of Jericho. It was a fortified city. We'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. But that's what his first encounter was going to be. And as he's nearing Jericho and leading the people there, our scripture says he looked up and saw a man standing there with his sword out. Joshua asked a question, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" Or like what we might say today, friend or foe. I think Joshua showed tremendous courage in the fact that he walked up to this man, having the sword out and everything, had extreme confidence. Of course, we know this man was God. He was the commander of the army of the Lord. And when he answers the question that Joshua asked, he says, "Neither, but as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come." And what Joshua did, he fell face down on the ground in reverence, and he asked him, "What message does my Lord have for his servant?" And the commander of the Lord's army replied, he says, "Take off your sandals, for the place where you stand is holy." And Joshua complied completely. Now, out of a study Bible that I was looking at this week, I just want to read a paragraph. It says, "As a sign of respect, Joshua took off his sandals. Although Joshua was Israel's leader, he was still subordinate to God, the absolute leader. Awe and respect are the responses due to our holy God. How can we show respect for God? By our attitudes and actions. We should recognize God's power, his authority, and deep love, and our actions must model our absolute reverence for God. Respect for God is just as important today as it was in Joshua's day." God appeared to Joshua to encourage him, to give him direction, to help him carry out God's commands. And that's what we're headed into now with our section of scripture about the battle at Jericho. Tell you a little bit about Jericho. It was like many cities of that time. There was three things they were important and looked out for, and that was a source of water and roads leading to it, and then its defensibility. And there was water there at Jericho. There was roads leading to Jericho, and they certainly worked on their defenses. Most people at that time thought that Jericho was invincible, that there was nothing you could do to them because they had walls, some of them 25 feet tall. Most of the walls were 20 feet wide, so guards could get up there on the walls and see for miles and miles and miles, so there was going to be no sneaking up on them by any means. So they were prepared, and I think if I read correctly this week, it took, the circumference of the city was like a third of a mile. Anyway, a big city. And that'll lead us to our second part of scripture, where it says, "Now the gates of Jericho were securely barred because of the Israelites. No one went out, and no one came in. Then the Lord said to Joshua, 'See, I have delivered Jericho into your hands, along with its king and its fighting men. March around the city once with all the armed men. Do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times with the priests blowing the trumpets. When you hear them sound a long blast on the trumpets, have the whole family give a loud shout," or have the whole army, rather, give a loud shout. "Then the wall of the city will collapse, and the army will go up, everyone straight in." Jericho, they were threatened by the Israelites. They had heard what had gone on in other parts of the Promised Land where they defeated some of the people. Joshua, remember, had sent in some spies into Jericho to check out some of their defenses and what have you. And that's where Rahab protected those spies. And we won't talk too much about that. That's a story for another time. But the people there at Jericho, they were aware of the Israelites being in the area. That's why they had the gates barred, and it said no one was going in, no one was going out. The people there were worried because they had heard what the Israelites had done. But then God says to Joshua, "I have delivered Jericho into your hands." He doesn't say, maybe you can defeat Jericho, or you're going to have to do that. I have delivered Jericho into your hands. Victory is assured. God is telling Joshua, you do what I say, and victory is assured. And then he gives him some very, what we would consider to be some odd instructions as far as how to defeat Jericho. It's not your usual military tactics, but anyway, it says, march around the city once with all the armed men and do this for 6 days, 1 time a day. Now, I read somewhere that at this time there were over 600,000 fighting men for the Israelites. So you got a lot of men that's going to be going around the city 1 time for 6 days. There's going to be 7 priests who are going to have these big trumpets made out of ram's horns that are going to be blowing the trumpet as they march around. But then it says on the 7th day, he says, march around the city 7 times with the priests blowing the trumpets. Then when you hear them sound a long blast on the trumpets, have the whole army give a loud shout. And God says the walls of the city are going to come down and you'll be able to go straight in. And I think about in terms of as we read this, again, that doesn't sound like an ordinary military tactic. But the Israelite army, they listened to what Joshua had to say, and they obeyed him and did as God had told Joshua. But you also have to think about the people there in Jericho. They're up on the walls watching the army marching around every day for 6 days, wondering what's going on. It's also odd, the seventh day, they march around 7 times. There's 7 priests. In our book, it says the number 7 is very important. 7 priests with 7 trumpets were to march around the city 7 days with 7 trips around the city on the 7th day. 7 is an important number throughout the Bible. It symbolizes perfection or completion, which reminds us that God's plan, no matter how crazy it may seem to us, is always perfect, and man cannot improve on it. But that's what God told Joshua, and that is why Joshua told the people. I got a question here out of a study Bible that says, why did God give Joshua all these complicated instructions for the battle? Several answers are possible. God was making it undeniably clear that the battle would depend upon him and not upon Israel's weapons and expertise. This is why priests carrying the ark and not soldiers led the Israelites into battle. This strange military maneuver was a test of the Israelites' faith and their willingness to follow God completely. The blowing of the trumpets had a special significance. They had been instructed to blow the same trumpets used in the religious festivals in their battles to remind them that their victory would come from the Lord and not their own military might. Our last piece of scripture says, on the 7th day, they got up at daybreak and marched around the city 7 times in the same manner, except that on that day they circled the city 7 times. The 7th time around, when the priest sounded the trumpet blast, Joshua commanded the army, shout, for the Lord has given you the city. And then it skips over to verse 20. When the trumpet sounded, the army shouted, and at the sound of the trumpet, when the men gave a loud shout, the wall collapsed, so everyone charged straight in, and they took the city. So they obeyed. They did exactly as they were to do. They marched around 7 times. They had the loud trumpet blast. And Joshua shouted to his army, shout, for the Lord has given you the city. And then at that point, the walls collapsed, and in the Israelite army went. It happened just like God told Joshua it would. In turn, Joshua told the people. They obeyed God's command. They followed every command that he gave. They didn't deviate at all. They showed their obedience to the Lord, and God delivered Jericho to them just as he had said. I want to read this. It says, consider the faith required to trust and obey God's directions for conquering the city of Jericho. When first hearing the plan, many Israelites may have thought, what kind of strategy is this? Who conquers a city with such a battle plan? And I think that would be a logical thought to have. And if you can put yourself in the place of maybe being a member of the Israelite army, I think that's what you're going to think. How are we going to do this? How are we going to win this battle? But they did what God told them to do, and they won. Anyway, our writer says the answer, God does, and his people do so by faith in him. God's bizarre, to human thinking, plan had an important spiritual lesson to teach the Israelites. Receiving the promised land could only be accomplished on God's terms. The people were not to compromise, ignore, or tweak the terms in any way. Even though the commands of God were unconventional, those commands were to be obeyed. Christians do well to remember that God's commands are still meant to be obeyed without equivocating. We know from Jesus that our first command is to love the Lord, and loving Him involves obedience. May we obey everything the Lord has revealed to us, that we may receive His blessings.